Hello everyone, and welcome back to another gear considerations video. Today I'm going to be talking about gloves, tactical gloves, if you want to use that fairly fitting term, but pretty overused. So I want to start this to preface everything by a pretty blatant question of asking, what are gloves for? And the answer to that is, of course, or maybe not, of course, but it is to protect your hands. Now, that seems blatantly obvious. Like, why am I even starting a video like that? The reason for that is there is a huge amount, as I said, of tactical gloves out there that don't actually even do that. For example, these fingerless ones, but we'll be talking about a lot more practical gloves and some considerations that you may have for the cut and just the design and certain features on them, at least from my experience. So we'll go ahead and get started with a feature I particularly like, and that is the attachment point. Generally you see on tactical gloves, but you don't see so often on normal gloves. So the attachment, you can see right here, this loop. You can use this to attach the gloves to a carabiner, for example. I really like to run a carabiner towards the front of my belt, and then I can just hook them there when I'm not using them, which is pretty frequently. You just occasionally need to take off the gloves to do something, or if you're overheating, just take them off for a bit to cool your hands down and then put them back on. Now, one thing you want to think about when you are looking at a pair of gloves, and this will depend on your specific environment, as everything does with gear, but if you were purchasing a pair of gloves for use more so in the winter, you might want to think about looking at ones that are designed to have the attachment point inverted. So generally the attachment point on tactical gloves is here, just at the wrist where it terminates. However, I have seen some of the higher end gloves that are more geared for winter. I forget the exact brand. There's a pretty expensive one, and I'm sure there's others out there, but one that I was looking at a while ago when I was selecting rain gloves has the attachment loop actually on the middle finger. And the reason that you'll want that, especially for the winter or rain, or even if you're just walking through the woodland environment, if you're going through particularly thick brush, because leaves and just all sorts of stuff will fall into them, is just because of that. For example, if you're in the snow and you go prone, like you need to go prone quickly when these gloves are stowed. That way, when you get up, the snow or whatever else is in them will just fall right out because they're hanging this way instead of this way. Sometimes I've noticed when I am just walking through the woods, if I take these gloves off for a bit and I'm just doing stuff in the brush, then I come out, I usually have to shake these out and just get little twigs and leaves and all that sort of thing out. So I would say that an attachment point of some sort, whether it's up here or at the very top, is very important. Then another thing that I would look for in a pair of gloves is where it terminates. So I would say in the vast majority of cases, you'll just want a normal, well, this is the norm, at least currently, for these types of gloves, is that they terminate right at the wrist, as you can see here. However, if you are going to be using these more in the winter or that sort of thing, I would go for a gauntlet type of glove, which will generally go a bit higher. But for normal use, it's just a bit too hot and a bit too cumbersome to have that. So whenever possible, I would go with the shorter types of gloves, unless you absolutely need the longer ones. And there are circumstances where you need it. Ideally, you just want a pair of both, but for everyday wear, just this type right here. And while I'm talking so much about winter and just different environments where you'd want to use different types of gloves, one other thing you'll want to think about is whether to use a mitten or a normal glove. I usually prefer to use a normal glove. I'm normally, in my environment where I am, it doesn't get extremely cold, but if you are somewhere where it does become extremely cold, you will want to think about using a mitten. Generally, what I prefer, if I am to use a mitten, is to just use one on my offhand and to still use a glove, albeit a very thick winter glove, on my shooting hand. And similarly, if it is cold but not super cold, what I do prefer to do is to wear a thicker glove on my non-shooting hand and just this type of regular shooting glove on my shooting hand. Again, for the same reasons, that way I have better control and can feel the trigger a little bit better. It's still not ideal because I am wearing gloves, but that way I don't totally freeze up, and then my other hand can stay warmer and it doesn't need to be as dexterous. So on to another commonly advertised feature this time, touchscreen compatibility. You see a ton of gloves have it nowadays. I am very conflicted on this. If you can find a pair of gloves that have good touchscreen compatibility, go for it. And also, please let me know in the comments, because personally, I've never found a pair of gloves that actually work properly with a touchscreen, even though they've been advertised for it. The vast majority of gloves I buy are touchscreen compatible, at least they claim. What I've generally found is that at least in the summer and the warmer months, that touchscreen compatible gloves are, at least most of the time, touchscreen compatible, but even then they don't always work. But what I have found, especially in the winter, is once you're out for even 10 or 15 minutes, when your hands and the gloves get cold, generally, and I'm usually only using phones, I'm not like a high-speed operator, so I'm not using a ton of different gadgets and all that. So if you are, maybe they're set up better for this. But in my experience, just trying to use a phone in the cold with those types of gloves, it doesn't work. And I'm usually only getting maybe 1 out of every 10 of my actual presses to actually be detected. Just a few pairs of gloves I have on hand. As I already showed earlier, there are these fingerless type. I would absolutely avoid any type that don't have all the fingers. I understand why you would want no index finger to have that better, trigger control, or at least that's the claim, but I would still avoid those gloves. They're more of a, personally I find them more of a gimmick than anything else. It's not that bad to shoot with gloves on. You can get used to it. Granted, thicker gloves, I can see that being an issue. It is an issue, but regular shooting or tactical gloves, it's fine. You can get used to it very easily. Another thing I don't particularly like in gloves, so generally the type of gloves I go for is the very thin type. That is what I prefer, because you still get most of your dexterity and it does protect your hand still really well. Another thing I don't like on gloves, but if you're a cool door kicker or whatever, you might want the type that have a reinforced, the back of your hand, you can see right there, like the knuckle area. The issue with these types of gloves that I really don't like is these, when you try to close your hand with these types of gloves on, it almost feels like it's like fighting against you, because it kind of is, because you have all this material here. It's very rigid. It's a very strong glove too. These don't wear out very quickly at all, but I would say it's not worth the trade-off in how uncomfortable they are. But if this is something you need for whatever you're doing, then go for it. But yeah, personally, I prefer the thinner types of gloves. The personal favorite that I've been using for quite a while is Mechanics Recon gloves, as you can see I have here. And a pair that I recently got is these pig gloves. These are also really nice. They are very thin. One issue with these, this is actually by design. If you can go either way on this. These are very, very tight, which again, great for dexterity, even better than those Mechanics Recon I was just showing. However, with how tight these are, so generally your gloves will just attach by Velcro. That's how most of them are, and then you slide your hand in and you just tighten the Velcro over. In the case of these pig gloves, they're very tight and they don't have any of that. You just slide your hand in. And the particular issue with that is, as I mentioned, I do tend to have to take my gloves on and off a lot. Even those, I believe they are supposed to be touchscreen compatible, and that's another one I haven't had very good luck with, at least so far. I haven't used them a huge amount, but they are hard to take off. It takes a lot longer to don and doff them, simply because they are so tight. Hence why I'm saying that the Mechanics Recon are still my favorite pair of gloves. I've used a bunch of, as I said, I generally use Mechanics gloves. That is my go-to brand. They're not too expensive, while not being complete garbage either. I've had these for about 8 months, I believe, maybe 9, and they are starting to rip. I have a hole starting here on the finger, which is currently very small. I don't think you'll even be able to see it on the camera. However, that of course is going to get bigger quite a bit faster, so there's definitely not a whole lot of time left on this pair of gloves in specific. I do prefer the thinner types of tactical gloves. Mechanics Recon are my go-to. That's probably going to be, I'm going to get another pair of these once these wear out. But just generally going for a thinner type for everyday wear, and then as you need it for special environments, depending on what you're doing, to get different pairs for that as well. Snow, rain, etc. Now, one thing about gloves that is a little bit different from the rest of gear, generally with a lot of gear, it's pretty expensive and you get what you pay for. In the case of gloves, it's kind of the same. Like, you don't want to go with a dirt cheap pair of garbage from Amazon or something like that, but I would absolutely not go with something that's really expensive either. The most I would spend on a pair of gloves would probably be about 40, and even that's quite expensive. But most of the mechanics are not too bad. The Recon, I believe, last I checked, were 35, so they're getting a little bit pricey. But gloves are high wear items. In my experience, even the more expensive pairs tend to wear out around the same time as the cheaper pairs. Granted, you're not going with a completely bottom of the barrel pair. I've had these, I've had different pairs of mechanics and just other gloves in general. I've had one pair, I don't know how I managed it, but one pair really lasted a few years, but that was on the high end, and then I've had other pairs that last as short as a few months at most. So they're high wear items, you will have to replace them, so I wouldn't get too invested in a particular pair. Just, you know, find a general style, as I said. Like, I like the thinner style, so just kind of go with something like that and just, I mean, be ready to replace them eventually. One last thing I wanted to touch on to finish up with the video, it's not directly glove related, but it does have to do with handling the guns with gloves on, and that is the trigger guards. Make sure to get a larger trigger guard. In my case, I'm using one of the Geissleys on this MR762. So there is a trick you can do with the standard, just straight trigger guards that you have on ARs at least. AKs don't really have this issue, but if you have one of those standard flat, just straight types, you can pop out the front pin and then just drop it down and shoot. That way, if you have thicker gloves on, I would say that's not ideal. I would prefer not to do that. If you absolutely have to, that's fine. But otherwise, having this wider trigger guard, as you can see here, and it really doesn't need to be that extreme. On my side charging AR build, I went a bit too extreme, which I really didn't need to do. But you just need a little bit extra in most cases, and that'll generally accommodate most types of gloves. So just keeping that in mind as well. And with that, that is everything I wanted to talk about in this video. So thank you all for watching. Let me know if you have any other questions or any additional feedback in the comments below. Otherwise, hope to see you all in the next one. Take care and see you all then.